Thanks for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast, including YouTube. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, or more importantly, Ole Miss every day. Am I right, Brian? That's what we're here to talk about, man. How you doing, Brian?
Doing good, sir. How about yourself?
I'm doing pretty good. Getting ready to do recruiting. I'm doing a show tomorrow, by the way, and this will happen after you get on there. The theme of that show for the Locked On Ole Miss podcast on Friday is death penalty. Not the hero we want, but the hero we need. And it's all about how in this NIL world and these rogue boosters going in and state laws, some school has to get popped. Some school has to get SMU'd. And if you do that, all of this NIL stuff can kind of fall back into line. But until it happens, it's going to be a circus.
You took the thought right out of the back of my head, brother, because there's no fear. There are kids to openly talk about it, like in interviews that go video, not just transcribed. You know, like the NIL at such and such is really good. We know what you're talking about. They'll say, so-and-so's offering. I mean, it's not uncommon. And there's no repercussion. At some point, NCAA, by the way, is the most toothless organization that I can think of in America. And that's saying something, considering how bad our politics are in this country. So it's embarrassing. We need some kind of, unilateral form of Texas has a different rule and all that. And I'm sure most people have seen that stuff where the NCAA's come out and said, you still have to follow NCAA guidelines, regardless of what your state legislature is trying to do. Those guys are trying to save their jobs by making boosters happy at State U all across the country. But I'll give the NCAA credit for that at least.
Yeah, and just take that Texas A&M situation in there. They're basically combining their capital foundation with their NIL fund to give different gifts, and then they're set it up to where their big Rose Group boosters in the state legislature has passed a law to shield them from NCAA repercussions.
Which is completely not going to work. But
if you're going to play chicken like this, there's two things that the NCAA controls that nobody can take away from. One is player eligibility. No matter what happens, they can take that away at the drop of a hat. The other is membership into the organization itself. 300 NCAA schools can say, hey, we don't want Texas A&M to be a part of us anymore. And next thing you know, what is it? Texas A&M's playing like Lindsey Wilson or something in the NAIA.
It's a really complicated mess, man, but it is some big boy chicken. But I think that a lot of the people in the Texas legislature, just to use that state as an example, and there are many others, they get voted in. And a lot of these boosters at these schools want their school to flat out have an advantage. Let's not kid ourselves. So is it going to work? No. The NCAA, it's the first time forever. Some of the stuff that I saw kind of flash on Twitter the last 48 hours talking about, hey, you still have to follow these guidelines. Now, saying it's one thing, though, because we opened with they haven't penalized anybody yet. So I'll believe it when you do it, though. But at least they said something, because the NCAA to this point had been pathetic. Maybe these guidelines, and there's some new people in leadership at the NCAA. Maybe they're finally like, look, we've had enough. It would be great if that was the case.
Yeah, and it's funny because for years, whenever the NCAA would investigate, they're always talking about it. Well, it takes too long and it doesn't penalize the coaches that are there and all of these arguments that everybody's heard. Well, in this situation, if they're going after collectives and these rogue boosters that are still attached to the university, it doesn't matter if it takes a while because
they root for one school. One school.
Yeah.
They root for just one.
Yeah, it's not a times constraint thing. And I do think, like you said before, this is a dangerous game of chicken, and I think somebody is going to get popped. And this is what my show tomorrow, the three things I would do. It would be a 3-strike program. If you get caught with major violations, now I'm not talking about paperwork level 2 and level 3 type stuff. I'm talking major violations dealing with tampering and things in the NIL space. The first year, you can't play the athletic sport that offended that year. You're done. You get the death penalty for a year. The second time it happens, the whole athletic department has to shut down for a year. And the third happens, you get removed from the NCAA.
I like those, but they're worried about the money is the problem.
Mhm.
And all those hurt the pocketbook. So
Mhm.
good luck with that, but I understand your point.
Yeah, but it's a situation, in my opinion. The reason I think that I said it and everything is because I think the penalties are so severe. It'll involve more self policing and more peer pressure in the
Oh,
community on these
let's
rogue
hope.
boosters. Yeah, and stuff like that is where you can get back on the rails, because I do think you can get back on the rails.
Well, if you had legislation that you passed that you actually enforced, and that's your
Mm-hmm.
whole point of your show.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's one thing to talk it, you got to walk it, bro. You got
Mm-hmm.
to walk it. And the NCAA is scared to death. So prove me wrong.
Yeah.
So
And the thing that reason I think this might work a little bit is not $1 comes out of the college athlete's pocket. It's not penalizing at all, and not 1 second is added to their residency requirement at a school. You can one-time transfer and all of that stuff. So players are taking care of this situation. The ones that would be the offending schools, and maybe those schools could police those boosters. Anyway, we got off track here a little bit. Let's talk recruiting. Let's start with Maurice Davis, an edge player. By the way, I looked at his huddle film and I actually commented on it a couple of weeks ago on Twitter. And actually, the kid liked the tweet, and I said, "Violence is a feature in this kid's game, not a bug." And he is an edge player that is extremely physical. And I'm not saying he's out there trying to hurt people. He just plays it really hard and really physically.
anytime you can get edge guys, it's a bonus. But his length, 6'5", 210, 215, whatever it is now, Ole Miss needs more of those guys. You and I have had this conversation. We're not worried about Lane figuring out the offense. They need more defensive guys to compete with Alabama and Georgia. This is the kind of kid that can help you do that, and they can build him up. And he's going to need a little more weight. But if you're a hitter already and you got that kind of natural athleticism and frame, this is a great starting point, man. You got to have more of them.
Yeah, exactly. And the next player we're going to go out and talk about is obviously in Arizona with Damon Williams is Dillon Hipp. And he has kind of a bizarre recruitment. He seems like a kid that just wants to get out of state. He might be a friend with Damon Williams. I don't know if there's any type of relationship there, but he's from that area. But it looks like it's an Ole Miss Baylor type situation at the moment.
Yeah, and I was trying to figure it out. I've read a few different things. I don't have contacts in Arizona, living in Florida, but I've never heard of an Ole Miss Baylor battle for an Arizona kid. I don't know how I'm supposed to decipher that one, but he does have a quarterback that he probably does know headed to play for Lane in the Ole Miss Rebels. So if I'm going to be placed in a situation gun to head, I'll take Ole Miss. At least there's some familiarity there, and it's a heck of a quarterback that would be directly responsible for him getting the football. So
Yeah.
that's my pick.
And Lane does a really good job with tight end players. That helps a little bit as well.
Oh,
Maybe that's what's got Dillon Hipp's attention.
well, any big bodied guy, whether it's labeled as a flex tight end or receiver, how often has Lane not served them well? You know, I mean, he does a tremendous job.
Yeah, pretty fantastic. All right, so let's do the top players in Mississippi. A little bit of an update, real quick before we get started. Um, it's an interesting situation. Ole Miss got a commitment from a Shemar Darden out of Tupelo, which Ole Miss always needs to be in Tupelo, and they have trouble in that getting into that school for whatever reason. It's like the opposite of South Panola. But Shemar Darden has, I don't know, I'm kind of blindsiding you here a little bit. He has Mike Hilton tendencies. If you remember Mike Hilton from way back in high school, he was like the 5'9", 5'10", but he was alpha dog of that defense. And Shemar kind of fits that bill. He sits back in the back, plays center field, and just goes and physically handles the run. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Tupelo High School gave up like 110 points all last season and gave up 47 to one team.
So they knew what they were doing. They're well
Yeah.
coached, obviously. Well, if your back end guy at free safety at the high school level is a dog, that's usually where you put him, so you can't avoid that guy. That tells me something. His ranking is bizarre considering he's going to play in the SEC West, though. I think 24/7, if I remember right, they're just in the state of Mississippi has him 35th or something.
Hmm.
That doesn't match. So maybe he just hasn't been evaluated. I don't know. But Ole Miss isn't just throwing out offers to be throwing them out either. So that's pretty wild.
Yeah.
But then again, state of Mississippi, as we both know and talked about many times, is not scouted like it should be. So
Yeah.
the rankings are at best iffy in the state of Mississippi, especially beyond the top 5 guys.
And by the way, Tupelo plays on blue turf, and that's probably the reason he hasn't been scouted because it's just terrible to watch a football game on blue turf.
That is a weird thing. I didn't know
Yeah.
they were like Boise State.
Yeah, it's a whole thing. All right, so top players in Mississippi. Is there an update of what's going on the top list?
There's only been, I mean, if you look at the overall top group, based at least on 24/7, almost everybody's committed now.
Hmm.
So to me, it's not so much about what's happened, it's what's going to happen next, because 2 reasons. And I actually want your take on this. Ole Miss has missed on some kids that I thought they would get. Mississippi State has hit on a few more. Who's going to flip? That's really the question that's in my mind. And you know this state better than I. Out of the top 5, 10 kids in the state, give me the 1 or 2 kids that you think are most likely to take visits and or flip down the road. Because that's what I want to know.
Yeah, if you look in my opinion, I would say I know that 3 players that Ole Miss covets is J.J. Harrell, Braylon Burnside, and Jimothy Lewis. That's obvious. But the most likely is probably Jimothy Lewis. He was at Oxford 3 times in 9 days before he committed to Mississippi State.
I saw that, yeah.
And you know, what happened, and this is the situation. For the year, Ole Miss and the Grove Collective, it made another top 10 list of being one of the leaders and one of the best collectives out there is the Grove Collective. And the Mississippi State version of whatever they call theirs has not really been there. It gets none of the applause, none of the things, and their recruiting before 10 days ago was essentially non-existent. Like their best player was like number 14 in the state.
Right.
So there was a player, Banks, out of Alabama that committed to Ole Miss, but it was an Ole Miss-Mississippi State battle for an Alabama kid. It was the most bizarre thing. Ole Miss ended up winning that. But as I talked to you last week, any situation like that is met with retribution. Now, is there stuff going on behind the scenes? I don't know, but I'm sure it is. If I know the state the way I think it is, something's going on. But the reason they committed J.J. Harrell and Braylon Burnside and Jimothy Lewis was for the PR win because everybody was talking about what their recruiting was doing up to that point. So I don't know. I think Jimothy Lewis is the most likely to flip out of the 2. I think Braylon Burnside is probably second, and J.J. Harrell has probably caught so much stuff he might stick with Mississippi State at this point. But that's how I think that would go. I would look for Jimothy Lewis 1 and Braylon Burnside 2 as potential flip candidates.
Well, it's pretty interesting because the only other kid like Daniel Hill and Kamarion Franklin haven't quote-unquote announced yet. Sounds like Franklin is Tennessee or Miami. Based on the intel that I have, Hill, Alabama, and South Carolina have been rumored forever. And I'm still surprised that a running back from Mississippi wouldn't want to play for Lane's offense, but that's neither here nor there. Besides that, everybody's pretty much done. Harrell is the one kid that I kind of wondered about. I know you and I have discussed him a few times. That offense, Mississippi State, I assume they're going to still go air raid. That's cool. But I wonder after this quarterback leaves what that's going to look like. So I'm sure Wayne's going to point to that as well. And he still may try to flip him. Just my own conjecture.
Yeah, just what you brought up. I asked the question because you were down at that camp when Kamarion Franklin was at Miami, the Legends camp. What's the intel from Kamarion from that camp?
He had a really good time. Everything I heard was Miami's right there. But Tennessee is the perceived team they're competing with more than Ole Miss. That's what I heard. Now, whether that's true or not, we're talking about recruiting in 2023. Everything's fluid. So it's not like Ole Miss or Mississippi State, for that matter, is going to give up on an in-state kid that's a big-time defensive lineman. So ask me again in a month. I have not seen anything as far as a date for him to make an announcement or even to narrow it like officially. It's been pretty quiet in that regard. So I don't think he's in decision mode yet. He may take a while.
No, it probably will. But I did tell you that South Beach was more in this than you realized.
They absolutely, everything I've heard from multiple people is exactly that. Absolutely.
And honestly, if a kid wants to go to South Beach, I don't blame him at all.
I get it
at all.
I get it.
to be 18, 19 years old, a football player running around on South Beach, yeah, sign me up for that.
Sounds like most kids would be pretty happy
Yeah,
with that as well.
sounds like a good time. Anyway, thank you for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast, including YouTube. Subscribe there. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you very much, Brian, for joining the show. We'll talk to you next week, bud.
Take care. Thank you very much, sir.
All right, man.